Please, I just want to leave these for him. For all of them. I know you can't. I know the rules, but please.
Today you'll discover the story of Margaret Chen, a mother whose grief would challenge one of America's most sacred military traditions. Prepare yourself for a narrative that will show how sometimes breaking the rules becomes the most honorable thing to do. Before we begin this incredible story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're listening to this story from. The morning mist hung heavy over Arlington National Cemetery as Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez adjusted his pristine white gloves for the 100th time that day. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood before him like a marble monument to duty itself, its inscription barely visible through the October fog that seemed to wrap around the sacred ground like a protective shroud. Michael had been a tomb guard for 3 years, and in that time he had never once deviated from the 21 steps that defined his existence. 21 steps south, turn and face east for 21 seconds, turn and face north for 21 seconds, then 21 steps north. The rhythm had become his heartbeat, the precision his religion. The cemetery was unusually quiet that Tuesday morning. Most visitors came on weekends or holidays, but today felt different. There was a weight in the air that Michael couldn't quite identify, something that made his usually automatic movements feel more deliberate, more meaningful. As he completed his southern march and executed his turn, Michael noticed a figure approaching the barrier rope, an Asian American woman in her 50s, wearing a simple black coat that seemed too large for her small frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, but strands had escaped and framed a face marked by exhaustion and something deeper, a grief so profound it seemed to emanate from her very being. Margaret Chen clutched a folded American flag against her chest, her knuckles white with the intensity of her grip. She had driven 12 hours straight from her home in Ohio, stopping only for gas and coffee that she never drank. The flag had been presented to her just 6 months ago when they lowered her son David's casket into the ground at a small cemetery back home. But David wasn't really there. David was somewhere in Afghanistan, or what remained of him was, scattered across a mountainside after an IED explosion that had taken him and 3 other soldiers. The army had done their best to recover what they could, but Margaret knew the truth. Her son was truly unknown now, just like the soldiers who lay beneath the marble tomb before her. She had come to Arlington not for answers, but for connection, to stand before the unknown soldier and feel somehow that she was standing before her son. The rational part of her mind knew it was impossible, but grief had long since silenced rational thought. Michael continued his measured pace, but his peripheral vision caught the woman's movement as she stepped closer to the rope barrier. Visitors often got emotional at the tomb, but something about this woman's presence felt different. There was a reverence in her approach, her understanding that spoke of personal loss rather than mere curiosity. The morning sun began to burn through the fog, casting long shadows across the white marble. Margaret watched the guard's precise movements, mesmerized by the dedication, the unwavering commitment to honor. Each step seemed to echo with the weight of sacrifice, each turn a promise that the fallen would never be forgotten. She thought of David's last letter, written just days before the explosion. He had told her about the Afghan children who would wave at their convoy, about the translator who had become like a brother to him, about his hope that his service meant something. "I'm not fighting for politics, Mom," he had written. "I'm fighting so that families like ours can sleep safely at night." As the morning progressed, more visitors began to arrive at Arlington. School groups with their hushed whispers, veterans with their proud bearing, and tourists with their cameras held respectfully low. But Margaret remained, standing at the rope barrier like a sentinel herself, her eyes never leaving the guard's rhythmic patrol. Michael had noticed her persistence. In his 3 years of service, he had seen thousands of visitors come and go, but few stayed for more than 20 or 30 minutes. This woman had been there for over 2 hours, and her presence had begun to affect him in ways he couldn't quite understand. The weight of her grief seemed to permeate the very air around the tomb. Michael found himself thinking about his own family, his own mother back in San Antonio, who worried every day about his safety, even though his greatest danger was probably tripping over his own perfectly polished boots. This woman's son hadn't been so fortunate. During his brief rest period, Michael learned from his relief guard that the woman had been asking questions. Not the usual tourist inquiries about the ceremony or the tomb's history, but deeper questions. She wanted to know about the unknown soldiers, about their families, about whether anyone ever came to visit them. She lost her son, Sergeant First Class James Patterson had whispered during the changing of the guard. Afghanistan. Body never recovered. She thinks maybe he's here, you know? In spirit, if not in body. The words hit Michael like a physical blow. He had always understood the tomb's significance intellectually, but this woman's presence was making it personal in a way that challenged everything he thought he knew about his duty. The unknown soldiers weren't just symbols anymore. They were someone's children, someone's brothers, someone's hopes and dreams reduced to marble and memory. Margaret had brought a small bouquet of white roses, David's favorite flowers. She had grown them in her garden every year since he was a child, and he would always pick one for her on Mother's Day, presenting it with the serious ceremony that only a 6-year-old could muster. The roses in her hand were from that same garden, the last blooms of the season, picked just before the first frost that would kill everything beautiful until spring returned. She wanted desperately to place them at the tomb, to leave some part of David's memory in this sacred place, but she knew the rules. She had read about them online, had called the cemetery office to confirm. No one was allowed beyond the rope barrier. No one was allowed to approach the tomb itself. The protocol was absolute, inviolable, sacred. Even Gold Star mothers had to observe the boundaries. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Margaret's strength began to waver. The long drive, the emotional weight of her pilgrimage, and the simple act of standing for hours had taken their toll. She had barely eaten in days, surviving on coffee and the kind of determination that only comes from a mother's love. She swayed slightly, catching herself on the rope barrier, her grip on the flag and flowers tightening until her knuckles went white. Michael saw her stumble and felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't just any visitor. This was a Gold Star mother, a woman who had given her most precious gift to her country. And she was suffering alone behind a rope that suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a cruel barrier between the living and the dead, between a mother and her son's memory. The afternoon changing of the guard ceremony drew a larger crowd. Margaret found herself pressed back by the gathering spectators, her view of the tomb partially obscured by tourists with their phones and cameras. She clutched the roses tighter, feeling the thorns press through her thin gloves, welcoming the small pain as a distraction from the larger agony that had taken up permanent residence in her heart. As Michael resumed his post after the ceremony, he noticed Margaret had moved to a bench about 50 feet away. She sat hunched forward, the flag spread carefully across her lap like a blanket, the roses wilting in the afternoon heat. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs that she tried desperately to contain, not wanting to disturb the solemnity of the place that had become her son's spiritual resting place. The sight broke something fundamental in Michael's military bearing. He had sworn an oath to protect the tomb, to maintain the dignity and solemnity of the sacred ground. But wasn't protecting the dignity of a grieving mother part of that same oath? Wasn't honoring her sacrifice as important as honoring the unknown soldiers who lay beneath the marble? For the first time in 3 years, Michael's steps faltered. Just for a moment, just long enough for doubt to creep in like fog rolling across the cemetery grounds. The protocol was clear, absolute, unchanging. 21 steps south, turn, 21 seconds, turn, 21 steps north. Never deviate, never break formation, never compromise the sacred duty. But the woman on the bench was compromising something deeper in Michael's soul. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret's condition worsened. The combination of grief, exhaustion, and the October heat had drained what little strength she had left. She had driven through the night to get here, stopping only when absolutely necessary, fueled by a desperate need to feel close to David one more time. Michael watched her during his measured turns, noting how she pressed the flag to her face, breathing in whatever scent of home and memory it still carried. He saw her lips moving in what appeared to be a one-sided conversation, and he realized she was talking to her son, telling him about the garden, about how the roses had bloomed especially beautiful this year, about how much she missed his laugh. The other guards had noticed too. During the next changing ceremony, Sergeant Patterson pulled Michael aside. "Rodriguez, you're distracted out there. Your timing's off by seconds. That can't happen." "I know, Sergeant. It's just that woman." "I get it, but you know the rules. We don't make exceptions. Not for anyone. The moment we start bending protocol, we dishonor every soldier who's ever stood this post." Michael nodded, but the words felt hollow. How could honoring a grieving mother dishonor anyone? How could showing compassion to someone who had sacrificed everything be wrong? As evening approached, the crowds began to thin. The school groups had departed on their buses, the tourists had moved on to other monuments, and even most of the veterans had paid their respects and left, but Margaret remained, now visibly struggling to stay upright on the bench. Michael's relief was scheduled to arrive in 30 minutes, but he found himself hoping the woman would leave before then. Not because he didn't want to help her, but because he was afraid of what he might do if she didn't. The thoughts running through his mind were dangerous, protocol-breaking thoughts that could end his career and disgrace the uniform he wore with such pride. But Margaret wasn't leaving. If anything, she seemed to be gathering herself for something, straightening her shoulders and gripping the roses with renewed determination. She stood slowly, unsteadily, and began walking back toward the rope barrier. Michael's heart rate increased as he watched her approach. She stopped at the rope and looked directly at him, her eyes red with tears but filled with a desperate hope that cut through him like a blade. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but somehow carrying across the sacred ground. "Please, I just want to leave these for him, for all of them. I know you can't, I know the rules, but please." The word hung in the air between them like a prayer. Michael continued his march, but every step felt heavier than the last. The woman's plea echoed in his mind, mixing with the memory of his own mother's voice when she had called to tell him about his childhood friend who had died in Iraq. Margaret held up the roses, and Michael could see they were beautiful despite their wilted state. White roses, pure and simple, the kind that spoke of love and remembrance rather than grand gestures. She had probably grown them herself, had probably tended them with the same care she had once given to raising her son. "His name was David," she said, louder now, her voice carrying the weight of a mother's love. "David Chen. He was 23. He wanted to be a teacher when he came home. He used to send me pictures of the Afghan children he met. He said they reminded him of his students back home." Michael's steps slowed almost imperceptibly. This wasn't just about protocol anymore. This was about a mother who had lost everything and was asking for the smallest gesture of recognition, the tiniest acknowledgement that her son's sacrifice mattered. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the marble tomb. In less than 20 minutes, Michael's shift would end, and another guard would take his place. Another guard who might not understand, who might not feel the weight of this moment the way Michael did. Margaret took a step closer to the rope, then another. She wasn't trying to cross it, wasn't attempting to violate the sacred boundary. She was simply trying to get as close as possible to the place where she believed her son's spirit rested. "I know he's not really here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I know he's scattered across some mountain in Afghanistan, but this is where I can feel him. This is where I can honor him alongside all the others who never came home." Michael completed his southern march and executed his turn. But for the first time in 3 years, he found himself looking directly at a visitor instead of maintaining his 1,000-yard stare. Margaret's eyes met his, and in that moment something passed between them that transcended protocol, transcended rules, transcended everything except the fundamental human need for compassion. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Michael had been trained to see through visitors, to maintain the sacred distance that preserved the solemnity of his duty. But Margaret's eyes held such profound pain, such desperate hope, that looking away felt like a betrayal of everything the tomb was meant to represent. Michael completed his turn and began his northern march, but his mind was racing. In 15 minutes, Sergeant Patterson would arrive for the evening relief. In 15 minutes, this moment would pass, and Margaret would leave with her roses unplaced, her son unhonored, her heart even more broken than when she had arrived. The protocol was absolute. In 3 years, no guard had ever deviated from the prescribed routine. The tomb of the unknown soldier was sacred ground, protected by tradition and military precision that dated back decades. To break that tradition would be to dishonor every guard who had walked these steps before him. But as Michael reached the northern end of his route and executed his turn, he saw Margaret sink to her knees beside the rope barrier. The roses fell from her hands as she pressed her palms to the ground, her body shaking with sobs that she could no longer contain. "David," she whispered, her voice carrying across the evening air. "I'm so sorry I couldn't bring you home. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." The words hit Michael like physical blows. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This wasn't about rules or regulations or military tradition. This was about a mother's love, about sacrifice, about the very values that the unknown soldier was meant to represent. Michael's steps slowed as he approached the southern end of his route. Margaret was still on her knees, still whispering to her son, still clutching the flag that had covered his empty casket. The roses lay scattered on the ground beside her, their white petals catching the last rays of the setting sun. In that moment, Michael made a decision that would change everything. Instead of executing his prescribed turn, Michael continued walking. He stepped off his designated path and approached the rope barrier where Margaret knelt. The sound of his footsteps on the marble caused her to look up, her tear-stained face filled with confusion and hope. "Ma'am," Michael said softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "would you like me to place those roses for you?" Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at the scattered flowers, then back at Michael, then at the tomb behind him. I can't ask you to do that. I know the rules. I know you could get in trouble." Michael knelt down and began gathering the roses, his white gloves stark against the white petals. "Some things are more important than rules, ma'am. Your son served his country with honor. You deserve to honor him in return." With infinite care, Michael collected each rose, arranging them into a simple bouquet. Margaret watched in stunned silence as this soldier, this guardian of sacred ground, prepared to break the most fundamental protocol of his duty for her sake. "What's your son's name again, ma'am?" Michael asked as he stood. "David," Margaret whispered. "David Chen. He was a good boy. He just wanted to help people." Michael nodded solemnly. "I'll make sure he's remembered here, Mrs. Chen. I'll make sure they all know about David." With that, Michael turned and walked toward the tomb. Each step felt monumental, each footfall a declaration that compassion could coexist with duty, that breaking rules could sometimes be the most honorable thing a person could do. Margaret watched in amazement as Michael approached the marble tomb. He moved with the same precision and reverence he had shown during his patrol, but now that precision served a different purpose. He was no longer just guarding the unknown soldiers, he was connecting them to the living, bridging the gap between sacrifice and remembrance. Michael placed the roses at the base of the tomb, arranging them carefully against the marble. As he did, he whispered a prayer for David Chen, for all the unknown soldiers, and for the mothers who would never stop grieving their loss. When he turned back toward Margaret, she was standing again, the flag clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face. But these were different tears now, tears of gratitude, of recognition, of a mother's love finally acknowledged. "Thank you," she mouthed, the words too precious for sound. Michael returned to his position and resumed his patrol as if nothing had happened, but everything had changed. The tomb felt different now, more alive somehow, more connected to the world beyond the rope barrier. The unknown soldiers were no longer just symbols. They were David Chen and thousands of others like him, remembered and honored by those who loved them. Sergeant Patterson arrived for the evening relief exactly on schedule, his polished boots clicking against the marble with military precision. As he approached the tomb, he noticed something that made him stop mid-stride. There, at the base of the monument, lay a small bouquet of white roses that definitely hadn't been there during his last inspection. Michael completed his final march and executed his closing movements with the same precision he had maintained for 3 years. But as he prepared to transfer his duties to Patterson, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "Rodriguez," Patterson said quietly as they performed the changing of the guard ceremony. "Those roses—" "Yes, Sergeant. You know what this means." Michael nodded. He knew exactly what it meant. It meant a formal investigation. It meant potential court-martial. It meant the end of his career as a tomb guard and possibly the end of his military service altogether. But as he looked back at Margaret, who was still standing at the rope barrier with tears of gratitude streaming down her face, he felt no regret. "I know, Sergeant, and I'd do it again." Patterson studied Michael's face for a long moment, then looked back at the roses, then at the woman who was slowly walking away from the tomb. Margaret moved differently now, her steps lighter despite her exhaustion. The crushing weight of unacknowledged grief had been lifted, replaced by the knowledge that her son's sacrifice had been honored in the most sacred place in America. "She's a Gold Star mother," Michael said quietly. "Her son David was killed in Afghanistan, body never recovered. She drove 12 hours to be here, to feel close to him." Patterson was silent for a long moment, watching Margaret's retreating figure. As a 20-year veteran, he had seen his share of grief, had attended too many funerals, had folded too many flags. He understood the weight of loss in ways that younger soldiers couldn't yet comprehend. "The roses are beautiful," Patterson said finally. "White roses, symbol of remembrance." Michael looked at his sergeant in surprise. "Sergeant? I didn't see anything unusual during my inspection, Rodriguez. Sometimes the wind blows things around. Sometimes visitors drop flowers that somehow end up in unexpected places. Nature has a way of honoring the fallen that transcends human protocol." The two men stood in silence as the last light of day faded over Arlington National Cemetery. In the distance, Margaret had reached her car, but she turned back one final time to look at the tomb. Even from this distance, they could see her press her hand to her heart and bow her head in a final gesture of gratitude. "You know this can't become a precedent," Patterson said. "We can't have guards breaking protocol every time someone has a sad story." "I understand, Sergeant, but this wasn't just any sad story. This was a mother who gave everything for her country and asked for nothing in return except the chance to honor her son's memory." Patterson nodded slowly. "The tomb isn't just about the unknown soldiers, Rodriguez. It's about all of them. Every soldier who never came home, every family that never got closure, every mother who still sets a place at the table for a son who will never fill it. Maybe sometimes honoring that requires us to think beyond the manual." As the evening deepened, other guards arrived for the night shift. The story of what had happened would spread quietly through the ranks, told in whispers during brief moments between duties. Some would condemn Michael's actions as a dangerous breach of protocol. Others would understand that sometimes the highest form of duty requires breaking the rules. Margaret drove through the night again, but this time the journey felt different. The roses were gone, but their purpose had been fulfilled. David had been honored alongside the unknown soldiers, his memory preserved in the most sacred ground in America. For the first time since receiving that terrible phone call 6 months ago, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The official investigation would come, as both Michael and Patterson knew it would, but it would find that the roses had appeared through unknown means, that no protocol had been officially violated, that the sacred duty of the tomb guard had been maintained. Sometimes the investigators would conclude, the wind does blow flowers into unexpected places. Years later, Michael would tell his own children about the day he learned that true honor sometimes requires breaking the rules. He would tell them about Margaret Chen and her son David, about white roses and a mother's love, about the moment when compassion became more important than protocol. And every year on the anniversary of that October day, a small bouquet of white roses would appear at the tomb of the unknown soldier. No one would ever see who placed them there, but everyone would understand their meaning. They were a reminder that behind every unknown soldier was a known family, a known love, a known sacrifice that deserved to be honored. The tomb would continue to be guarded with the same precision and dedication it had always known. But now it carried something additional, the knowledge that sometimes the most sacred duty is not following orders, but following the heart.